Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, the world feels like a crazy place at the moment, doesn't it? Especially when you consider that every click, swipe, social media, share, like, and indeed everything that we do online will be stored on a server somewhere. And that server will have a profile next to our name with thousands upon thousands of data points. And that's before you consider every image of you that's been taken and tagged out there is combined with facial recognition. And in China, that facial recognition can take your image and match it against every single camera that you walk past and reveal where you're going, who you spend time with. And that's before we even get to track and trace apps. Suddenly the line, "I don't care about privacy, I've got nothing to hide," suddenly that argument is disappearing and we're starting to take privacy more seriously. And I am an optimist and I like to think that that was never the original intention, and it feels like in many ways we're tiny children playing with complex and sophisticated toys, trying to change the world for the better. But we've accidentally caused a few digital dilemmas that we all must address and somebody needs to take responsibility for. So today I've invited Hilary Wandal, Senior Vice President, Privacy Intelligence and General Counsel at TrustArc, onto the podcast today to explore some of those dilemmas and responsibilities. And Hilary has over 20 years in data privacy and has helped shape national and international privacy policies. So I'm also curious what changes she's seen in her career. So buckle up and hold on tight, and I will beam your ears all the way stateside so we can speak with Hilary right now. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Hilary. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Neil. It's a pleasure to be on with you today. So I'm Hilary Wandal. I am the head of privacy intelligence at TrustArc, and I also serve as the company's general counsel. Privacy intelligence is probably something most people haven't heard of before, Neil, and so I'll just share a little bit more about what it is that we do and how we describe that in terms of the new innovations we're trying to bring to the privacy space. So what I do every day is I work with a team of researchers and developers, both software developers as well as developers more on the privacy analytics side, to take all the requirements of laws and regulations, whether they're codified in a law itself or whether it's interpretive guidance from a regulator or whether it's a court decision, and boil those down into the nuts and bolts, if you will, the component parts of how they get applied to what people do in businesses every day. And so what we try to look at is, how does the law apply and where does it apply to what kind of businesses, but not just in the traditional sense, the way lawyers typically have thought about it, but more in a business sense. So if you will, we're trying to take all of the requirements and turn them into metadata that then can be used by technology to help deliver people insights and enable more rapid decision-making about privacy and data risks within business so that businesses can actually make better decisions. So it's a new space. It's very exciting, and glad to be on to talk more about that with you.
Thank you so much. And I've been so excited to get you on the podcast today because I think it is such an important topic. And maybe for many years, people have always, I think I've heard a lot of conversations where people say, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry. But I think over the last 3 to 4 months, we're all starting to realize the importance of data privacy, especially around things like facial recognition. And you do have over 20 years experience in data privacy and have helped shape national and international privacy policy. But I've got to ask, what are the biggest changes that you've seen throughout your career?
Well, it's been so interesting. In fact, as you were saying, and people oftentimes have said, and to me in my job over the years, well, Hilary, I don't really have anything to hide, so why do I care? That's not really that important of a topic. I'll recall, Neil, way back to my early days doing privacy and actually helping to set up the privacy program at Merck, where people said, well, privacy is not really a real area of the law. It's not something that's ever going to take off. And I certainly didn't know what would happen. But it's been interesting to see how privacy has actually become one of the most rapidly growing areas of law around the world, and new requirements are being adopted in countries that never had protections before, and new laws actually specifying how best to protect data and manage people's privacy rights and interests in different contexts continue to evolve and get adopted really on a monthly basis is what we've seen historically prior to COVID-19. But in terms of the things that I've seen, the biggest changes over time, it's the perception one that I just mentioned, that people are starting to recognize it wasn't just a short-term issue or something that really wasn't that big of a deal. Privacy, especially with the advent of increasingly complex technologies that have both made our lives easier but also complicated them, that privacy issues really are at the forefront. And it's necessitated that the law actually act in response, and that businesses become much different kind of stewards of data in thinking about their responsibilities. So I think in some respects, the change has been, it went from an area that was a bit more esoteric, if you will, to an area that is really at the center of how people think about decision-making, both in their personal lives, as well as in the daily business decisions, as far as how businesses both operate, as well as what they think about in terms of their overall strategy. One of the other things, Neil, I would share that's been an interesting change, and I would say a challenge, is just how, with technology evolving as it does, it's expanded the ability for businesses to operate 24/7 and to connect, as we see all the time, with colleagues all over the world, with outsourcers and individuals in the supply chain all over the world. And that has caused a need to really understand how to make sure that data as it flows is protected appropriately. I still remember back about 12 or so years ago when cloud computing was just becoming a thing, that there were concerns about how do you ensure that all of these restrictions in laws, like at the time the EU Data Protection Directive, but some of the other laws too in certain countries, think about Argentina as one example, had restrictions on cross-border data flows. And how would organizations be able to manage those restrictions without encumbering the ability for data to flow as it needs to? And what's been an interesting change, but yet maybe not changed fast enough, is seeing various different regulatory bodies come together to look at mechanisms to facilitate international data flows, and at the same time having local regulators sometimes put in place, and usually it's a regulator from a different part of the government, putting in place localization requirements because they're concerned about making sure that people have the appropriate protections, both from a civil liberties perspective, but also from the perspective of protecting jobs and countries. So I think that's one area that, in my view, has not changed enough. It is changing, but too slowly to really keep up with the pace of how data actually wants to move around the world.
Absolutely. And it does feel in many ways that for years we've been blindly using technology to try and change the world for the better. And all those years later, here we are in 2020, and we're faced with all these digital dilemmas. For example,
yes.
Here in the UK, there is concern that the UK government over here has selected a centralised track and trace system, not the decentralised option that Apple and Google have been suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
So on that topic alone, I mean, what are the implications of contact tracing? Do you think it could be a slippery slope that could lead to government surveillance if not monitored and regulated?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's inherently a slippery slope to pull together a database, centralized, that potentially could be used for other secondary purposes. I think having that centralized creates the risks that people will use it not just for the original purpose for which it was created, but for all kinds of unintended purposes in the future. And I think that's one of the things we've seen over the years, Neil, in privacy and data protection, is that the original intent for which data are collected is generally never the only, it never stops there. It's once the data sit there, as long as they're stored, they may be used for lots of different innovative reasons and important reasons, oftentimes health and safety reasons or other public interest reasons, or just other business reasons by people who can get access to that data. And we've seen that happen more and more over time. I know one of the areas that there's been a lot of concerns about in the past, and just leads into the issue of contact tracing that you've raised. One of the issues in the past has been around genetic databases, biological sample databases, and how as it becomes increasingly easy for organizations and individuals to re-identify using just the slightest bit of DNA, how that creates risks for individuals in terms of potential discrimination, stigmatization, use of that data in ways they never would anticipate. All of that said, leading back to the topic that you raised around contact tracing, people have concerns that if the data all sit in a centralized database, what might the government do with it? So I think there's very, very good intent in having the data all available to people who are trying to stop the transmission of the disease, trying to understand better the actual nature of the transmission. Where is it more likely to spread? I think we've seen some interesting things recently come out about clarification around asymptomatic individuals or people who may have come in contact with the virus just through surfaces. We've seen through the results of a lot of the epidemiological studies that it actually isn't the most likely way in which people will get the disease. And I think contact tracing can help epidemiologists and other scientists better understand the origin and the origin of the disease and the nature of the transmission. That all said, as soon as it sits in a centralized database and you don't have restrictions on the access, there's all potential unintended consequences where it could be used, for example, to understand people's lives in ways they never anticipated, to actually use it potentially for surveillance, as you said, but also potentially for government enforcement purposes in ways that you never know what kind of regime may come into place in the future and how they could use that in ways to stigmatize people, to harm people, to isolate people, to discriminate against people. And those who have access to those systems, what might they do to actually stalk people or do all kinds of criminal activities? So centralization of databases in and of themselves is problematic. And I think what Google and Apple have tried to do to make sure that the relevant data sits on the device and actually is used to help send the right signals to enable people to take actions is a much better way of protecting people's privacy at the source to prevent those kinds of unintended consequences, if you will, from happening.
And one of the things that I love about the conversation we're having here is we've just took a very tiny subject, such as contact tracing, which is created with all the best intentions, which is exactly how we started this conversation. But then as soon as you start to drill down on centralization, and then another question, of course, is does your employer have the right to access your health information if you contact the virus, or are they even responsible for knowing if you have tested positive or negative? It just creates more and more questions and more responsibility, doesn't it?
Indeed, Neil, it does. The interesting thing about the question you just asked about whether an employer has the right to access health information, I'm going to answer it that part in and of itself, and then let's get into a bit more if they've contracted the virus. So should an employer have the ability to access health information generally? Well, in the law, across the board in a lot of different jurisdictions, an employer should not have the ability to access health information unless there's a need to give an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation, so that the employee can actually work effectively. So we know that in a number of cases, in order to protect people with disabilities, reasonable accommodations are very important. We also know that in the health and safety context, employers have responsibilities under laws in many jurisdictions to make sure that employees actually have a safe and healthy work environment. And so for employers to provide that, oftentimes they do need to know some basic information so that they can protect employees, other employees in the whole workforce, and everyone who comes into the space appropriately. But does that mean they need to know anything detailed about a diagnosis? One would say generally, no. However, what we're seeing more and more in the context of COVID-19 is a bit of a different angle. And the bit of a different angle goes to the degree of potential harm and the risk to individuals in the workplace if somebody they've been around has been exposed to COVID-19. And that's where there's a very fine line and definitely a gray area in many cases as to what information does an employer need to know. Does an employer need to know the specific diagnosis of COVID-19? In some cases, an employer would argue yes, so that they have the ability to protect the rest of the workforce appropriately. And what we do see in certain laws is that particularly the regulators that are responsible for health and safety, the regulators that are responsible for public health have come out and explicitly said, yes, an employer has the right and the need to know that solely to protect the workforce, but not for any other reason. And so it's important for employers then to look at their responsibilities and to balance those in a way that makes sure they're not collecting more information than they need to, especially where the law is not entirely clear. And then in cases where the regulators have come out and said, well, no, you don't actually need to know the diagnosis. You just need to make sure you're putting appropriate protections in place. So, for example, before you allow somebody to come into work, they've actually had a health status check in the morning, and they've made sure that they have checked themselves for whether or not they have a fever, for whether or not they have symptoms, such as coughing and other things. And if they do, they should stay home. And so there's that fine balancing that's going on, Neil, with respect to employers managing their responsibilities to protect the workforce from harm, and employers looking at their responsibilities to protect the workforce from a privacy and data protection perspective, which is the other side of harm. And it's two sides of the same coin in terms of protecting employees, protecting the workforce generally. And the answer, as you can see from my response, is not black and white. It's very gray, and it goes to the need for at all times employers to not approach this, and businesses generally, not to approach privacy as a black and white check the box issue, but rather as one that involves thoughtful discourse and responsibility and stewardship in how they're handling information and the responsibility to the communities they serve and the individuals with whom they interact.
Fantastic. And on a slightly separate note, on a more positive note, you could argue that we have had GDPR for over a year now in the UK and Europe, and it has forced companies to step up and take greater responsibility around privacy. There are a few niggles around the user experience side of things, but what are your expectations for enforcement of the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, which I believe begins in July? What are your feelings around that?
Indeed, it does. It's slated to come into full enforcement as of July 1st. What we've seen at TrustArc is and being headquartered in California, we're very close to what's happening with respect to the CCPA. And it's been very interesting to see how businesses are preparing. In fact, we've just done some research. We published the results of it today, where we've seen that we're seeing that the CCPA does become effective, but yet businesses have been waiting to see whether or not the Attorney General is truly going to enforce. We expect, and the Attorney General has gone on record that he will enforce, his office will enforce beginning on July 1. But in terms of how, I think that's really remains to be seen. If I were a predicting person, what I would say is the most likely space of enforcements will be in the context of data sharing that might constitute a sale, given the way that selling is characterized under the law, and a look at whether businesses who engage in online advertising in particular are providing the right links to opting out, to give consumers the right to opt out on their websites. If I had to predict, that's one of the first things that they'll focus in on. Very likely will focus in on, just as we saw in GDPR, how businesses are holding themselves out to the public and to the consumers that they process data about, how they're actually protecting those rights, how they're enabling individuals to exercise those rights. Have they created updates or updated their privacy policies to show that they're actually being mindful of their obligations and complying with their obligations under the CCPA. So I think that's likely where we'll see the first area of enforcement. And I think it's not inconsistent with what we saw with respect to GDPR enforcements and some of the initial data protection authority focusing in on consent and focusing on transparency with respect to privacy notices, particularly in more the advertising ecosystem and the various different players that are involved there.
And I think it can feel incredibly confusing and bewildering for businesses to try and navigate. So can you tell me a little bit more about how at TrustArc you're simplifying privacy, compliance and other data protection regulations with this combination of technology and expertise? Because I think that's what makes you guys stand out, because it's not just all about the tech, it's the combination of both, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, Neil. At TrustArc, we have really honed in on the fact that privacy is one of the most complex disciplines that businesses need to address, and growing more and more, because what we've seen and what we manage is that there are close to 1,000, 900 plus laws and regulations that affect businesses around the world, depending on where they operate. And there's a lot of complexity inside each of those laws as to what you need to do to be responsible with respect to managing data, to make sure you're providing the appropriate level of transparency, to make sure you're managing all of your suppliers and other partners with whom you share data, to make sure that you're providing for the rights for individuals, you're managing risks appropriately, you're securing data, and so on and so forth. All of those obligations exist in different ways, in different laws, in different jurisdictions, and certainly for businesses that operate in more than one country, more than one province, more than one state, for example, in the US, you get into a lot of complexity in trying to navigate through. And over the years, if I go back, Neil, to my early days of dealing with privacy, typically what you did is you read a law, you figured out what you needed to do, and then you looked at another law, and you started to put the requirements with respect to those multiple laws, those 2 and then 3 and then 4, into a spreadsheet, and you compared the different requirements. And then you started building out policies to help you make sure you were complying effectively, and you worked on your transparency requirements, and you worked with your people responsible for your customer relationship management databases and your HR databases to make sure they were building the appropriate transparency and consents and access controls into those databases. And what we found is, well, that worked maybe 15 years ago. Today, people are inventing new apps every day. People are putting new processes in place. They're hiring new suppliers. They're working with new parties. You cannot keep up with that using the manual approaches. And so what we found at TrustArc is it's really critical to be able to monitor what's happening with respect to changes in laws and regulations, and to be able to deliver that in an insightful, contextual way to people who are operating in the business so that they know exactly what they need to do at any given point in time. And so at TrustArc, what we spend time doing is looking at how those requirements are relevant to the various different operational activities that businesses need to undertake with respect to privacy. So when they're engaging a new supplier, a new vendor, when they are putting in place a new system, when they are looking at how to respond to a data subject rights or privacy rights request, and depending on the nature of that request and where it's coming from, what are their specific obligations, and how do they manage those obligations across everything that they're doing in a way that does not become overly cumbersome and burdensome, but rather enables each of the different people in the organization to do their part. And then the person who's managing privacy, whether that's a data protection officer, a lawyer, somebody like a CISO in the business, has the ability to see what's happening and be able to share that out with key stakeholders and report it up to executive management and to the board of directors in a very simple way. So that's what we focus on at TrustArc, trying to make it simple. And what we found is it requires a level of understanding of the different regulations, a level of automation around privacy from a technology perspective, and those two things coming together in a way that is very customized to the needs of a specific business, depending on how it operates at any given point in time.
And I'm curious, from the conversations that you're having, are companies recognizing the importance of privacy and good data protection, data governance, or are they still a little bit unsure about it, and are they treading carefully? What's happening in those conversations?
Well, it's really fascinating and very timely, as I shared earlier. So TrustArc just did a global privacy benchmark survey and in the month of May, so last month. And one of the things that we were looking at is how companies are addressing privacy generally, their mindset around privacy, their confidence in privacy, how they're dealing with CCPA, how they're dealing with the COVID-19, the pandemic crisis, and how it's affecting the way in which they're prioritizing privacy. And what was really exciting about the data that we saw in the survey results released today is that businesses actually are incredibly mindful of privacy beyond what I had thought when we actually designed the survey. They actually are taking privacy very seriously. Overall, 80 to 90% of our respondents actually are confident that their businesses are mindful of privacy and the importance of it. What I would say more broadly at TrustArc in our day-to-day work with companies is we're finding that laws like GDPR and CCPA, so some of these newer laws that have gotten a significant amount of attention, but also have very big operational components to them, have caused businesses to realize that they can no longer have privacy as something that they do on the side. Privacy needs to be embedded in how they operate. And so they're starting to approach it very differently, appoint more senior level people to be responsible for influencing how it's handled. And they're prioritizing it in terms of budgets, investments around the things that they need to do. It's not just a surface area or check the box approach anymore. More and more businesses are investing very heavily in becoming responsible stewards of data and making sure privacy is at the center of how they think about that.
And one of the things that I love doing on this Daily Tech podcast is busting myths about technology or in any particular industry. Now, this may take a long time. It's often very therapeutic, but I've got to ask, are there any myths about privacy that you would like to finally lay to rest today?
Well, first of all, that privacy is just about personally identifiable information, or what people have labeled with the acronym PII, or that it's just about confidentiality and secrecy. Privacy is actually a very multifaceted discipline that goes to data about people and their lives. And, that's data that's not just collected from someone. It's data that's generated about someone. It's data that's observed about someone, but it's also data that is part of who they are as human beings. They're a core identity. It's the biological data, the genetic data that can be generated out of just a fingerprint or a blood sample or a piece of hair. So easily we're leaving our privacy all over the place as we walk around. It's about communications. It's really a whole part of your identity as an individual. And if we think about businesses' responsibility to protect privacy and our responsibility more as a society overall, as communities overall, we need to think about beyond those myths of it's just about secrecy and I have nothing to worry about because I don't care. We all have things we don't even know about ourselves embedded deep within our DNA. And if we think that privacy is just about secrecy and things that we think we know, well, we're actually fooling ourselves. It's actually much deeper, and it goes to the core of who we are as individuals. And it's important for us to protect that and make sure that as aspects of who we are get revealed to us, that we're the first people to know, not necessarily others that might use that information in a way that's unintended or untoward.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you on that. And finally, to end on a positive note, is there anything that particularly excites you or at least makes you hopeful about the future of privacy?
What excites me the most is I think at TrustArc in particular, we've stumbled upon this way to try to deal with the complexity in a way that will enable businesses to really further embed privacy in their day-to-day decision-making. I also am really excited about the fact that we're getting to a place where people are understanding more, as I was just saying a bit earlier, that privacy is more than just about personally identifiable information. Privacy is about data, about people. And as we figure that out and we think about it more, privacy then becomes part of the core of responsible decision-making within businesses. I'm excited about how we can help businesses understand that by doing privacy well, they can actually make better decisions and actually be more strategic in how they engage with their customers and how they generate more trust in the way that they conduct business overall. And my big hope, is that that translates into more trust in the world in which we all live every day.
Well, a huge thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today and talking about I think we've covered so much ground today. But for anyone listening that would like to carry on this conversation that we've started today or find out more information about what you're doing at TrustArc, could you just point them in the direction of your website and also how to contact your team?
Certainly, Neil. So our website is www.trustarc.com. That's spelled TrustArc.com. And people should feel free to reach out and contact us there. I am also at Hilary Wandal on LinkedIn and on Twitter at Hilary Data Law. So that's my Twitter handle, and we'd love to hear more from people with feedback on the topics we discussed today. So thank you so much.
Well, I'll add all those links to the blog post that will accompany this episode over on my website. But there's so much I loved about chatting with you today. And in particular, the line that you used there, that privacy is so much more than personally identifiable information. Privacy is essentially about data. It's about people. I think it's a fantastic note to end on. But more than anything, just a big thank you for joining me today, Hilary.
Thank you, Neil. It's been such a pleasure. Really have enjoyed our conversation.
I love chatting with Hilary about the implications of contact tracing and the slippery slope that could lead to government surveillance. But not just that, it also opens up so many other debates and raises even more questions, such as, does your employer have rights to access your health information if you contact the virus? Or are they even responsible for knowing if you've tested positive or negative? It just creates more and more questions. But of course, the good news here is we're talking about the responsibilities of privacy and taking it seriously. But over to you. I will pass the virtual microphone your way, and this is your opportunity to share your insights and your opinions. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, just at Neil C. Hughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. And I'm also in the process of launching 2 new podcast shows, one with Netgear and another with Citrix. More on that story soon, but I will leave you with that big teaser. So a big thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.